For instance, the fantasy genre gives you such a ability to write something that has never been seen before. But then again, 90% of fantasy books walk the same path. They retread the same things that have been done before. For instance, stealing from J.R.R. Tolkien. By the way, let's make this into a top 5 video. The first trope I hate in the fantasy genre is how there is countless people out there that are stealing from J.R.R. Tolkien. Why are so many? Of course, I understand. The guy is a genius and he was so ahead of his time. This guy was doing stuff that no one has done ever before. And he didn't do it one time. He did it like hundreds of times. This guy is basically the Einstein or the Newton of the fantasy genre. But why so many? And why so long? Even modern fantasy, because a lot of people will argue, oh, modern fantasy doesn't steal a lot from J.R.R. Tolkien. Yes, it does. A ton of modern fantasy is basically J.R.R. Tolkien tropes retreaded and redone, but it's slightly different, given a modern spin. And I don't want people to steal from J.R.R. Tolkien anymore. We have done enough. We have stolen from this guy enough. It's time we write our own stuff. For instance, if you really love J.R.R. Tolkien, be like George R.R. Martin. Be like George R.R. Martin, the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin was basically raised on Lord of the Rings. He was raised on Lord of the Rings. This guy loves Lord of the Rings. He would die to meet J.R.R. Tolkien. Okay, but at the same time, with the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, in his world, in magnum opus, he does not really steal much from Lord of the Rings. There are of course, he tips the hat to the great man, but technically speaking, he does his own thing. He is a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, and he respects J.R.R. Tolkien enough. And he respects J.R.R. Tolkien enough to actually have his unique world. In fact, most of A Song of Ice and Fire cannot be compared to the world Middle Earth. Keep that in mind. This guy loves him so much. Don't do it. Don't steal from J.R.R. Tolkien. To do something else. One of my favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson, with his magnum opus like the Stormlight Archive. It is not in any way stealing from J.R.R. Tolkien, and it is one of the most respected, critically acclaimed fantasy books out there. You don't need to steal from J.R.R. Tolkien to be critically acclaimed. Then why the And I actually want to encourage fantasy authors, if there's maybe one of them watching, please cut it off. Please stop that. We have stolen from him enough. It's time we stop. And then there is the lack of diversity in the fantasy genre. But this one is actually quite the opposite. I just don't like medieval fantasy. I am okay with white people in the fantasy genre, because you see, when people talk about diversity, they talk about it in terms of like, okay, we need less white people. I actually don't care about that. In fact, I just don't want medieval fantasy. What about different white people? Hey, because there's a lot of white people. Why are we obsessed with the Crusades and English medieval Western fantasy? It's not even like most of medieval Europe. It's like Western part of medieval. What the And I think it will make the fantasy genre better. In fact, some of my favorite, like Sword of Kagan, Poppy War, these are two that just came to mind. But these two books are phenomenal. These two books are not medieval fantasy. In other words, in much the same way with the first one, you don't have to steal from J.R.R. Tolkien to be critically acclaimed and to be respected in the fantasy genre. You don't have to have medieval fantasy for you to be respected in the fantasy genre. I hope that you can agree with me, because you don't need medieval fantasy to be accepted in the fantasy genre, number one, and number two, to be critically acclaimed in the fantasy genre. It's that simple. Again, the act itself is not bad, it's just that there's too much. There's too much. That's the problem. There's too much. Why in the world are we using magic as a cheap solution to the conflict? There is a conflict in a story. There is going to be a magical object that will solve the problem for the protagonist. Why do we have this? Do we need this? Again, as I said, we can move on to better things. In other genres, they do not depend wave of the wand solutions to solve their plots, to solve their problems. And it is therefore way more interesting. And this is what I want to, acclimate your head with. The reason why using magic as a wave of one solution to the conflict is because first of all, it kills tension. Like when you do it one time, that's it, you lost me, because next time I have read enough and I'm going to remember, and I know this and I know where it goes. So finally, I'm going to remember next conflict to not give a damn. You can use magic as a solution. It just has to take more effort than, just, oh, I swallow this, or I got this object, therefore, or I have this wand, I'm going to wave it, therefore the problem is solved. Don't do that. It's boring. It's not engaging. And I don't want that anymore in the fantasy genre. We can use magic to solve conflict. We just have to do it such that it feels earned. And then there are resurrections. Resurrections. Why? In much the same way, using magic to solve problems in a cheap way, therefore taking away conflict, resurrections, if you just use them, you just told me that your characters, any one of them can come back from the dead. If they are running into a battle, I am not going to be engaged. I am sorry, unless they are Gandalf the White, I am not going to be engaged. It's that simple. It's that simple. I will not be engaged with any further conflict. In fact, that's how much I hate resurrections. Unless there is a cost to coming back. Unless what we have is really not a resurrection, more or less a zombie, right? Because George R. R. Martin does this with Lady Stoneheart. But guess what? Lady Stoneheart, when she comes back, all we have is a reminder that we lost someone beloved. And that to me it hits hard, bro. It punches hard. Like that shit is not easy to take. In fact, it's so difficult to take. And so, as I said before, don't steal from J.R.R. Tolkien. A lot of people have done that. It's not engaging, right? And don't have a lot of medieval fantasy. And don't use magic as a cheap solution. All of that is me telling you we can move on and we can do better. And we don't need all of those things to be critically acclaimed. In much the same way, you don't need resurrections. Your story can be better without resurrections. This is a revolutionary idea. Consider not killing your character. Time travel. What in the world are we doing with time travel? Time travel happens so much in fantasy books. We don't need that. Because time travel, just that word, why can't you go back to a point where you can just kill the child version of the villain? Number one. Number two, if you can't do that, you just came up with silly restrictions to time travel and you just put in yourself, like, again, unless you are a very skilled author, just don't do it. Because again, I think you can figure this out. I think you can do it. You just have to be very skilled. And 99% of people are not very skilled. Therefore, likely you are not the one, you're not the prophecy, it's not going to be you, okay? The greatest people still avoid time travel. I don't know why people are obsessed with it. I don't know why you would want it. I don't see anything good coming out of time travel. And if I see something good coming out of it, it's done by very skilled people. Like thriller writers, science fiction authors are very skilled people who know how to use time travel effectively to achieve very nice result. A lot of people in the fantasy genre, when they use it, they just don't do it as well as those people, and they just end up messing the whole continuity. And they mess up the continuity far worse than, like, being inconsistent with your magic system will ever do. Anything in the world, it will never mess up your plot and the continuity of your world and the consistency, the logical internal consistency of your world more than time travel. Nothing in the world can. If you know something, please let me know. And so yes, those are 5 fantasy tropes I really don't like. I hope that you enjoyed this. Have a nice day.